The hum of the spaceship's engines resonated through the small cockpit as Chris angled the craft toward the distant planet Zyre. In the cabin's filtered light, his tired eyes darted across instrument panels to confirm coordinates. Zyre had been abandoned for centuries, according to the data logs from the Interstellar Engineering Coalition. It was a world that had once boasted advanced cities and thriving technology, only to fade into near mythological obscurity after a tragic collapse no one fully understood. Chris was an experienced engineer, not a historian, yet the assignment to investigate and catalog any functional relics drew him more powerfully than any job he had taken before. Officially, he was a contractor for the Coalition, charged with uncovering, analyzing, and possibly salvaging ancient machines rumored to lie dormant on the planet's surface. Unofficially, a curious ache in his gut told him something about Zyre would change his life forever. He could not have guessed how accurate that instinct would prove. He slowed the craft as it neared the planet's exosphere, taking note of the swirling brownish-gold hue that encompassed most of the planet's surface. A labyrinth of cloud banks, tinted by the local star's unusual spectral output, drifted in lazy formation above. Long-range scans from orbit showed significant radiation pockets scattered around old industrial centers. He took a deep breath. "It looks so still," Chris whispered, half to himself. Hard to believe this place was once a bustling hub. He double-checked his autopilot settings and engaged the descent thrusters, mindful of the swirling winds that battered his craft. As the ship pierced the thick atmosphere, turbulence rattled his seat. He steadied himself, eyes flicking from the forward window to the altimeter, ensuring a controlled landing. Slowly, the craft descended upon a plateau scattered with towering basalt columns, perfect for a stable landing zone. The landing struts extended with a mechanical hiss. Chris exhaled relief when his indicators confirmed a steady touchdown. He peered outside through the reinforced glass. The Zyre landscape looked spectral and lifeless, dominated by wide plains of windswept dust and jagged canyons carved long ago by rivers that had since dried. A swirl of fine grit danced around the hull. Though images and descriptions of Zyre had been transmitted by passing survey drones, the reality of standing upon a world lost to time filled him with reverence. He briefly recalled the bedtime stories he had read as a child, of explorers braving unknown worlds, uncovering secrets that would reshape galaxies. Now, he was that explorer. With practiced efficiency, Chris donned a specialized breathing mask, tested the environment's toxicity level, and confirmed the planet's reduced oxygen content was borderline safe but required supplementation. He extended a portable ramp, stepped onto the stony ground, and let out a long breath. "All right, Zyre," he murmured through the mask. "Let's see what you're hiding." Even before departing for this expedition, Chris had studied the limited accounts from scholars and the ragged data transmissions of centuries past. They spoke of a glorious civilization, advanced in engineering and proud. The planet had been a key nexus for scientific knowledge across the quadrant. Entire treatises on solar energy, mechanical automation, and clean resource usage had originated from Zyre. Then, for reasons unknown, the transmissions ceased. Rumors circulated of a cataclysmic war or an environmental collapse. The path ahead led through a canyon bristling with ancient metal pylons. They jutted from the stone like the ribs of some colossal, extinct creature. Their surfaces rusted and battered by erosion, a silent testament to the planet's decline. Faded markings near the base suggested they once carried power from extensive solar fields to cities hidden beyond the horizon. Chris hoisted a small data collector from his supply pack. Holding it near one of the pylons, he measured radiation levels, scanned for structural integrity, and sighed. Most looked irreparable, decayed beyond safe functionality. Still, the design was impressive. Each pylon's composition contained alloys unknown to modern engineering. His curiosity grew with every beep of the collector. Hours passed as he traversed the canyon. The local sun, tinted pale violet through the dust-laden sky, crept toward the horizon. Long shadows stretched from the pylon remains, lending the place a mournful grandeur. All was quiet except for the crunch of gravel under his boots and a faint whisper of wind echoing through the ravines. He eventually found what might have been the remains of a road, large plates of metal hammered into the ground, forming a corridor beneath the dust. It aimed toward an outcrop that towered above the dusty plains. With a shrug, Chris followed. To his surprise, as he emerged around the bend, the remains of a vast settlement sprawled before him. Tall skeletons of collapsed buildings stood in silent formation, with rusted beams and fractured domes that once might have been shining architectural marvels. The entire settlement was crowned by a central tower, half-crumpled, its apex broken off and lost to time. Chris was no stranger to ruins. He had cataloged deserted outposts on minor moons and visited the crumbling remains of spacefaring civilizations that vanished. But something about Zyre tugged at his emotions, as though the planet itself was beckoning him to unravel the mystery. He found a secure vantage point on a stable ledge and pitched a small portable camp, setting up solar modules to power his data collection gear. He typed his daily report for the Coalition, but found he had little actual data, just atmospheric scans and structural analyses. He ended his entry with a simple reflection. Zyre is quiet, but I sense it guards something extraordinary. I can almost feel it breathing beneath the dust. We'll continue exploration tomorrow. With that, Chris powered down, clicked off the interior lamp, and closed his eyes, lulled by the gentle hum of the wind, not knowing that come dawn, everything he believed about Zyre would shift. Sunrise on Zyre was an event of subtle splendor. The local star, rising over jagged mountains, cast ribbons of pale amethyst across the sky. The dusty atmosphere scattered the light, painting the broken towers in ghostly silhouette. Chris rose from his cramped bunk, rubbing a crick in his neck. He brewed a quick synthetic tea, stepping out of his camp to breathe in the crisp morning air. He unrolled a battered map compiled from the Coalition's ancient scans, determining a route into what looked like the heart of the ruin. Not far from the central tower, old records suggested there might be a subterranean facility. If any of the famed Zyre technology still functioned, that might be where to find it. He followed what remained of wide, boulevard streets. Stubborn vines with slender, silver leaves had grown out of cracks in the metallic pavement, weaving around fallen columns and shattered glass domes. Closer to the center, he realized that not every structure was entirely ruined. A few had partial roofs, some even boasted intact walls. Strange lumps of reflective plating glinted in the morning light, possibly remnants of advanced solar collectors. As Chris approached an open courtyard, he spotted something truly unexpected. The faint shimmer of an energy field, a rudimentary barrier of sorts, humming quietly at the courtyard's edge. Odd, he thought. How could a power field persist after all these years? And more importantly, who maintained it? He crept closer, scanning with his data collector. The readings were a jumbled mix of ancient energy signatures, near the end of their charge. Then came a sound that made him freeze in place. A metallic clang, followed by a soft grunt of exertion. Curiosity overcame caution, and he edged around a corner to find, kneeling beside a battered array of solar panels, a lone figure. She appeared mostly human at first glance, her lean frame bent in concentration over a piece of machinery. Her hair was an unusual shade of ashen white and bound tightly in thick braids. She wore patchwork garments, obviously crafted from available materials, with slivers of broken circuit boards repurposed as protective plating. At her side lay tools, some modern by the look of them, others improvised from scrap. Chris watched for a moment as she tinkered with the panel's circuitry, cursing under her breath when sparks danced across her knuckles. He was about to speak when her eyes flicked up, instantly locking onto him with alarm. She sprang to her feet, brandishing a spanner as if it were a weapon. Her gaze narrowed, and Chris raised his palms in a gesture of peace. "Wait, I'm not here to harm anyone," he called out through the breathing mask. I thought this planet was uninhabited." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, her expression flickered with confusion, then wonder. Finally, she spoke in a voice that resonated with a curious melodic lilt, her accent unlike anything Chris had encountered. "You are human?" she asked. Chris nodded. "I'm from Offworld, from the Interstellar Engineering Coalition." For a moment, her posture relaxed. Slowly, she lowered the spanner. "You're an engineer?" she said, hope creeping into her eyes. "Then you can fix these panels for me? The entire settlement depends on them. What's left of it?" Chris blinked. "Depends on them? Are there others?" The question lingered. She hesitated, scanning him as if deciding whether she could trust him. The morning light revealed a faint pattern on her skin, almost iridescent markings along her neck and forearms, suggesting she might not be entirely human after all. Finally, she angled her chin in a regal nod, as though resigned to share her truths. My name is Lena, and yes, I'm what remains of the original inhabitants, or as close as we have to them. There are a few of us left. You'd be surprised how life finds a way to persist, even here. Chris exhaled in relief. So there was at least one living soul on Zyre, and the glint in her eye suggested an intelligence and determination he could not help but respect. He stepped forward, kneeling by the damaged solar panel, gently touching the burned-out circuit. I can take a look, he said softly, but it'll help if I know more about how your system is set up. Lena studied him for a moment before crouching as well. Follow me afterward. I'll show you the power lines that remain. If we can get them running, we might just have enough energy for the others. The others? He repeated her phrase, but she only nodded, cryptically. Chris bent over the panel, rummaging through his bag for a universal scanning device and a micro-welder. As he worked, Lena watched his hands with keen interest. She occasionally interjected with quiet instructions or cautionary remarks about how the panels had been jury-rigged. Their conversation remained guarded, but the tension eased. For Chris, an entire dimension of Zyre had suddenly come to life. Over the next hour, the two of them worked in companionable silence. Sparks flew in bright arcs as Chris replaced damaged connectors. Lena explained that the solar panels charged a battery array deep below ground, an array feeding what meager lighting, climate control, and agricultural modules remained in operation. At last, Chris reconnected the final wire, and the panel whirred to life, absorbing the violet rays from the sun. Power trickled into the battered grid. He watched the readout on his device climb from near zero to a modest but steady level. Lena let out a soft laugh. I never thought I'd see that again. A stable current. She smiled, a beautiful, tremulous expression, and he realized how desperate her circumstances must have been. Follow me, she said at length, gesturing toward a towering archway that led toward the ruins. My people, what's left of them, will want to meet the man who repaired the panels. Winding their way through the collapsed streets, Chris noticed that behind the facades of toppled structures lay pockets of habitation. Doorways had been reinforced, windows sealed with thick plastic gleaned from salvage, and open courtyards converted into communal gardens. The place was not entirely lifeless after all. Here and there, he saw flickers of motion, an eye peeking from a cracked door, a scuttling child with pale skin that bore the same iridescent patterns as Lena's. It dawned on Chris that these survivors were near-human people, perhaps genetically adapted to the planet's harsh conditions, or the product of centuries of local evolution from an originally human colonist group. At length, Lena led him into a grand structure near the city center. It resembled a temple or administrative hall, half collapsed at one end. Columns of intricately carved stone lined the central space, and dust-laden murals covered the walls. The air inside smelled of old incense mingled with machine grease. A group awaited them, a small assembly of men and women, each wearing a similarly patchwork arrangement of garments. Their expressions ranged from suspicion to awe. One tall, older figure stepped forward. His face bore lines of age and sorrow, and a band of hammered metal, possibly a sign of leadership, sat around his forehead. Lena greeted him with a curt bow. Father, she addressed him in a formal tone, I found an off-world engineer, by chance or fate, repairing the old solar panels. He has brought light to them once more. The older man studied Chris through narrowed eyes. We have not seen a true off-worlder in many years. The last ones came only to plunder, leaving us more desperate each time. He paused, scanning Chris's face as if to read his intentions. Are you here to salvage, or will you help us rebuild? Chris felt the weight of this question. He glimpsed the haggard lines on the faces of those who had clearly endured hardships beyond his imagining. I came for salvage, yes, he answered honestly. I'm under contract to the Interstellar Engineering Coalition. But if there's a chance to help your people, and to preserve what's left, I want to do so. A hush filled the hall as the elders exchanged glances. Lena's eyes shone with renewed hope. What is your name, off-worlder? Her father asked. Christopher Wynne, Chris said. But please, call me Chris. Lena's father offered a thin smile. I am Veron, the elder caretaker of this settlement. We are all that remains of a once great civilization. Our ancestors called themselves the Zyrians. Now we are but a handful, scattered across the planet's surface. Chris nodded, remembering the rumors. I've read about Zyre in old logs, but I never imagined anyone survived. Varon sighed. Many did not. The wars, the plagues, the final cataclysms, all served to decimate our population. We lost technology, knowledge, contact with the stars. He gestured around them at the crumbling hall. For centuries, we have struggled to keep the last vestiges of our planet's systems running. Another figure stepped forward, a woman with sharp, discerning eyes. Young Lena is our greatest hope. She has been learning to maintain and repair what we can salvage. She was even teaching herself to read ancient schematics, but it has been slow work. The woman paused, assessing Chris. Your presence might tip the balance in our favor, if you do not betray us. Chris set his jaw, feeling a mixture of resolve and pity for these people who had been abandoned by history. I promise I won't betray you. I only ask to learn about your technology, your ways, and to help. Murmurs and cautious nods followed. Lena looked at him gratefully, though a veil of worry haunted her expression. If Chris had come centuries ago, they might have thrived. Now was it too late? Varon raised a thin hand, calling for silence. Let it be known that we accept Christopher Wynne as a guest among us. He shall walk freely here, so long as he abides by our code of conduct. At that, the small assembly visibly relaxed. A sense of relief mingled with guarded optimism. Chris could almost feel the intangible cords of trust forming between them. Lena approached. We should show you the central power station, she said quietly. That is our lifeline, and it's in dire need of restoration. Chris nodded. Lead on. They left the hall, weaving deeper into the settlement, past more crumbling walls and improvised dwellings. The scale of the destruction was overwhelming, but the pockets of stubborn life, children playing, women tending small hydroponic trays, men forging tools from scrap, proved that Zyre was not entirely lost. They arrived at a massive door, half sealed by collapsed rubble. With some effort, they squeezed through, descending a broad flight of stairs that led underground. The subterranean chamber stretched farther than Chris anticipated, riddled with cables, pipes, and gutted control panels. Dim overhead lights flickered from an emergency circuit, revealing row upon row of humming machinery. A mosaic of antique engineering, it combined designs reminiscent of Earth's early fusion reactors with far more advanced alien technologies. Vast conduits glowed faintly, transferring energy from the solar panels above to the city's battered grid. He saw areas riddled with burn marks, presumably from short circuits or catastrophic overloads. Entire aisles of equipment lay in twisted ruin, testament to the centuries of neglect and destruction. Lena led him deeper, pointing out crucial segments: an ancient converter, a precarious distribution node, a half-functional regulator. Each subsystem was only a hair's breadth away from total collapse. This is it, Lena said solemnly, her voice echoing in the vastness. The heart of our city, maybe of all Zyre. If we lose this place, we lose everything. Chris carefully inspected one of the main conduits. The metal had worn thin, and the polymer sealants were cracked. He gently pressed a fingertip to the surface. It was uncomfortably warm. This is in danger of overheating, he said, grimacing. You've lost a lot of efficiency, possibly 70% or more. If you're not careful. A meltdown, Lena finished. Yes, we've had close calls. He exhaled. The scale of the needed repairs was staggering. I have tools, but some might not be suitable for your older designs. We'll need to improvise, maybe scavenge from other parts of the city to find the right components. Lena brushed a hand across her brow. Whatever it takes. I'm just relieved you're here. Before, we were only guessing at solutions. It's been a losing battle. He shared a small, encouraging smile. Well, let's see if we can turn the tide, at least. In that moment, Chris realized that for all the official reasons that had brought him here, fate or destiny might have had a bigger hand. If Zyre had any chance of revival, it needed an off-world engineer's expertise. And if he was honest with himself, he was glad to assume that role. They spent the rest of the day assessing each subsystem, noting problems and potential fixes. Lena scribbled notes on a handheld slate. Chris occasionally used his data collector to measure energy flow, atmospheric composition, and even structural stability. As they worked side by side, a bond formed through shared purpose, two determined souls forging a path against despair. At one point, a distant rumble reverberated through the chamber. The lights flickered dangerously. Lena stiffened, her face turning pale. "Dust storms," she said. "They can strike without warning, wreaking havoc above ground. Let's hope the panels survive." Chris glanced at her sympathetically. "Is there anything we can do?" She shook her head. "We just wait. When it passes, we'll see if the damage is manageable." Silence descended as they continued their inspection. The faint hum of power was the only steady comfort in the gloom. Hours later, exhausted and covered in grime, Chris and Lena climbed the stairs back to the surface. The dust storm had mostly subsided, leaving a rusty haze drifting through the half-collapsed alleyways. They paused, surveying the settlement. A few ephemeral lights flickered in windows, proof that life carried on. A battered sky dome overhead revealed the swirling cosmic tapestry beyond the dusty atmosphere. Chris felt a pang of unexpected affection for this battered place and the people clinging so fiercely to existence. He found himself turning to Lena, about to remark on the strange beauty of Zyre at dusk, but her face was laced with grief. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "The solar array that you repaired. 2 more were destroyed by the storm." The news hit hard, but Lena squared her shoulders. "We'll salvage what we can. Tomorrow." He placed a reassuring hand on her forearm. She did not flinch from his touch. "One step at a time." She nodded, eyes shining with tears. Then, as if catching herself, she composed her expression. "We should rest. There's much to do, and little time." They made their way toward a cramped dwelling that served as Lena's workshop and living quarters. Lena unlatched a reinforced door, beckoning him inside. Chris's gaze swept over shelves stacked with mechanical parts, tools, half-repaired circuit boards. A small cot stood in the corner. "You can stay here," she offered, noticing his uncertain glance. "I have another area for sleeping. It's not much, but it's safer than setting up camp in the open." "Grateful," Chris nodded. "Thank you." The day's weariness overcame him quickly. Before he drifted into sleep, one last thought lingered: the improbable resilience of these people, and the growing sense that his presence here was far more than mere luck. Morning brought a sky still heavy with dust. Chris worked alongside Lena to salvage the damaged solar arrays on the outskirts of the settlement, a precarious task as winds threatened to whip the dust into a blinding storm. They managed to reclaim enough intact panels to restore a portion of the city's power needs, though the total capacity was pitiful compared to the demands placed on the aging infrastructure. Still, progress was progress. Each day, they restored a bit more. Chris introduced new methods of circuit insulation, patching up battered conduits with specialized materials from his ship. Lena led him to hidden caches of old Zyrian technology, from which they salvaged rare components. Their synergy was remarkable. As trust deepened, conversations grew more personal. Lena recounted bits of Zyre's tragic history, passed down through oral tradition. There had been a golden era, art, science, commerce flourishing, with the city's power station fueling everything. But political tensions and resource squabbles escalated. War erupted. Bioweapons ravaged the population. The once pristine environment suffered irreparable damage. "What about outside this city?" Chris asked one evening, as they tinkered with a broken distribution node. "Are there other settlements, survivors?" She sighed. "Small enclaves, scattered. We barely trade with them. Travel is dangerous. Some are rumored to have fallen into primitive ways, or worse." He looked into her sad eyes and realized how truly alone they all were. Lena smiled wistfully. "But we endure, because the Zyrian spirit refuses to vanish. My father says that for each generation that persists, we honor those who came before. And maybe, one day, we can rebuild." Chris admired her resilience. "I believe you will," he said softly. "We can fix this place, piece by piece." The flicker of gratitude in her gaze was answer enough. Word spread quickly that an off-worlder with advanced knowledge had arrived and was aiding the settlement. In the subsequent days, Chris noticed the atmosphere among the inhabitants shift from despondency to guarded optimism. People would approach him with mechanical components, broken circuit boards, or household appliances, seeking repair or improvement. He helped whenever he could, often with Lena at his side, guiding him to make solutions that fitted their environment. One afternoon, an elder woman approached him with a strange request. "You've done so much for us already," she whispered, trembling hands clasped around a broken wrist device. "We hoped you might also restore this. It's a communicator from the old times. We thought if it could be made to work again, perhaps we could call for help beyond Zyre." Chris took the device and examined it. "I'll see what I can do." He recognized that even a single functioning off-world communicator could open possibilities for trade, rescue, or perhaps re-entry into the galactic community. But the device's internal components were so corroded that repairing it seemed a long shot. Still, he promised to try. Later, as Chris and Lena wrestled with circuit diagrams on a battered table in her workshop, a commotion came from the central hall. Voices rose in argument, quick footsteps echoed. Then the door to the workshop burst open, revealing a tall figure whose features were more alien-like than Lena's or any of the other near-humans Chris had seen thus far. His skin shimmered with the iridescent patterns that marked the Zyrians, but they were denser, more pronounced. His eyes were large and a brilliant turquoise. He wore ragged robes adorned with archaic symbols. Lena scowled, stepping forward protectively. "Sareth, what are you doing here?" "We're busy." Sareth sneered, casting a dismissive glance at Chris. "I see the off-worlder is occupying all your time these days," he said in a tone laden with jealousy or disdain. Chris stood, uncertain. "Can I help you with something?" The tall alien's gaze flicked over him. "Oh, I doubt it," Sareth replied. Then he fixed Lena with a burning look. "But I have come to claim what is rightfully mine. Our traditions demand that a union be formed with the caretaker's family. You belong to me, Lena. And with that union, the settlement's power resources will be safeguarded by my authority." Chris's mind reeled. He had no context for such traditions, but his gut churned. Lena's face twisted with anger. "I never agreed to that. The old ways are not absolute anymore." Sareth took a step closer, ignoring Chris, and his tone grew more urgent, almost desperate. "You know what is at stake. Our lines must be preserved. If we do not bind our families, we risk further fracturing. Zyre's future depends on reuniting the old houses." Lena's jaw clenched. She turned away, refusing to meet his gaze. At last, Sareth turned to Chris. His intense turquoise eyes bored into him. "And who are you to stand in my way? You, a mere off-worlder, cannot begin to understand the legacy of Zyre. I come from an ancient lineage, and I will not see it diluted by inaction." Before Chris could speak, Lena interjected. "Sareth, you forget yourself. Chris has done more for this city in a few weeks than you have in your lifetime. If you truly cared about Zyre, you'd work with us, not spout archaic demands." Sareth's nostrils flared, and for a moment, Chris thought he might lash out. Then the alien let out a ragged breath and straightened. "I will not yield. The caretaker's daughter is to be my bride, by right and by the will of the elder families. No one can reverse that." He turned to Chris, voice low and threatening. "Mark my words, off-worlder. If you stand in my way, I will have no choice but to do what is necessary to maintain order." With that, Sareth spun on his heel and strode out, leaving a tense silence behind. Chris stared at the door, heart pounding. What was that about? Lena rubbed her temples as if warding off a headache. "Sareth is from another settlement. He claims heritage dating back to the warlords who rose after the cataclysm. My father tried to keep the peace, forging alliances when possible. Sareth was promised a union with me under the old codes, but we've tried to move beyond such archaic decrees." Chris's lips parted in shock. "So he's demanding you marry him, to consolidate power?" She nodded, eyes clouded with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Yes, he thinks that if he binds our families, he can rule unopposed. He believes it's his right, in part because of his bloodline, and in part because the caretaker, my father, once saw it as a way to prevent strife between the enclaves." Chris felt a protective surge. "Do you want to marry him?" Lena let out a bitter laugh. "No, absolutely not. Sareth is ruthless. He believes in dominating, not uniting." She paused, scanning Chris's face. "But if he stirs up trouble, it could lead to conflict. We can't afford that." Chris placed a hand gently on her arm. "We'll find another way. I promise." She gave him a faint, thankful smile. But the shadow of Sareth's threat loomed large over them both. The next few days were marked by tension. Whispers spread throughout the settlement that Sareth had visited, demanding Lena's hand. Some older folks, clinging to the traditions that had guided them in darker times, argued that compliance might be the safest option. Others, inspired by Chris and Lena's work, believed it was time to break from the yoke of ancient laws. Varon, Lena's father, summoned Chris and Lena to a private chamber within the half-ruined tower. He wore a look of weariness, deep lines etched upon his face. "It seems we stand at a crossroads," he said, voice heavy. "Sareth wields influence with rival enclaves, and if we refuse him outright, he may provoke an attack that our settlement is ill-equipped to handle." Lena's eyes blazed. "We can't let him force us into submission. Not after all we've worked for." Varon cast her a pained look. "I know, child, but I also fear the alternative. Our people might suffer greatly in a conflict." Chris spoke up. "What if we strengthen your defenses, or forge alliances with friendlier settlements?" Varon sighed. "Easier said than done. Our resources are strained. The technology you and Lena have revived has given us hope, but it may not be enough to fend off a coordinated attack." Lena clenched her fists. "Then what do we do?" Varon hesitated, then turned to Chris, face drawn in anxiety. "It has been suggested, by some, that if you, Christopher Wynne, were to marry Lena instead, the caretaker's line would remain intact without bowing to Sareth's bloodline. Zyre's future might then be forged in partnership with your advanced knowledge and ties to the outside galaxy." Chris felt a shock pass through his system. Marry Lena? The thought blindsided him. He glanced at her. She stood tense, cheeks flushing as she looked at the floor. Varon grimaced. "I know this must sound absurd. You have only just arrived. But if you declared your intention to unite with Lena, it would show Sareth that we have chosen another suitor, someone we trust to help preserve our city, not plunder it. Our laws recognize that if the caretaker's daughter willingly chooses a partner, it can override any previous arrangement." Chris's mouth went dry. This is so sudden." A heavy quiet settled, broken only by the faint hum of the old walls. Then Lena lifted her gaze, eyes bright with determination. "Father, this isn't how unions should be formed. Chris has done so much, but I can't just." She paused, looking at Chris with a mix of uncertainty and hope. Unless you truly wanted to, for reasons that go beyond mere politics. I refuse to be a pawn." Chris exhaled shakily. The swirling emotions in the room made it hard to think. Could he truly consider such a commitment? He was an off-worlder, bound to a contract with the Coalition. His original plan had been to examine Zyre's technology and then depart, returning with a report. But in the intervening weeks, he had grown to care deeply for these people, and especially for Lena. He met her gaze, and a silent communion passed between them. In her eyes, he saw not a desperate alien or a helpless damsel, but a strong, intelligent partner. Someone who shared his passion for rebuilding, for engineering, and for giving Zyre a second chance at life. "Well," Chris said at length, swallowing the lump in his throat, "I can't say I ever imagined this scenario, but if we're discussing it honestly, I do feel a strong connection. I respect Lena, admire her, and I want to help Zyre in every way I can." He turned, meeting Varon's somber gaze. "But this must be Lena's choice, not just mine. And I don't want to claim her as some old right." "That's exactly what we're trying to avoid." Varon nodded, relief warring with concern in his eyes. "We will abide by Lena's decision." All eyes turned to her. She hesitated, tears shimmering. "I cannot deny I feel a bond with you, Chris. But it's such a huge step, and I don't wish to trap you here or force a marriage purely for politics." Chris moved closer, gently lifting her chin. "I may have come here on official business, but my heart has been captured by what this planet and its people stand for. The resilience, the hope. And by you." A single tear traced down Lena's cheek. "Then, I am willing." Varon, seeing their resolve, allowed a thin smile. "We will make an announcement. Sareth must know he has no claim." Though the plan was set, a mixture of exhilaration and trepidation gripped Chris. He had come to Zyre alone, expecting only to investigate ancient machines. Now, he faced a future entwined with Lena, and with the fate of this broken world. Word traveled fast. Lena, daughter of the caretaker, had chosen to unite with the off-worlder. A day later, Sareth arrived once more, flanked by a small entourage. Fury etched his features as he confronted Lena, Chris, and Varon in the settlement's central courtyard. How dare you do this? Sareth seethed. You would break an ancient pact, rejecting our lineage, for a stranger who only just stepped onto our soil? Lena squared her shoulders. I have the right to choose my own path, Sareth. You know this. Our laws are clear. Sareth's eyes flashed, and for an instant, Chris thought the alien might draw a weapon. But Sareth merely clenched his fists, speaking in a dangerous hush. You betray not just me, but centuries of tradition. This will mean war. Varon stepped forward, staff in hand. We do not seek violence, but we will not be threatened. Go in peace, Sareth, or face the consequences of attacking a caretaker's settlement. A mocking grin twisted Sareth's lips. So be it. If war is what it takes to redeem our people from your meddling, then war you shall have. Without another word, he and his entourage swept away, cloaks billowing in the dusty wind. The courtyard stood in tense silence. That evening, the settlement buzzed with worry. People prepared defenses in earnest, reinforcing weak walls, stockpiling resources in the power station, and forging makeshift weapons from scrap. A sense of dread and determination pervaded. Chris spent hours in Lena's workshop, rigging additional security measures. He taught the locals how to seal doorways with electromagnetic locks triggered by simple passcodes. He and Lena devised portable energy shields using spare solar converters and old shielding tech. Though meager, these innovations might give them a fighting chance. Meanwhile, Lena conferred with scouts who traveled between enclaves, hoping to rally friendly neighbors to their cause. Some promised assistance, others feared retaliation from Sareth's warband. Amid the whirlwind, Chris and Lena found themselves alone in a quiet moment. Leaning against a half-repaired generator, they took each other's hands. You know, she said softly, this is hardly the romantic union a girl dreams about. Chris chuckled, though his heart was heavy. No, it's not exactly the typical courtship. But I want to see this through. For Zyre, and for us. She squeezed his hand. I do too. A faint quiver of uncertainty lingered in her eyes, but a gentle warmth blossomed between them. Their lips met in a tender kiss, an unlikely promise of unity amid the swirling darkness of an impending conflict. Under a sky roiling with bronze-colored clouds, Sareth's forces arrived at dawn. Rudimentary vehicles crawled over the dusty plains, bristling with crude energy cannons. Warriors on foot carried spears fitted with electrified tips, archaic yet lethal. Within the caretaker's settlement, watchposts sounded alarms. Doors were sealed. Families huddled in cellars. The power station thrummed at near capacity as it struggled to maintain lighting, minimal climate control, and the new defense systems. Chris manned a makeshift command center near the main gate, communicating with watchers posted atop battered towers. Lena stood beside him, scanning sensor readouts. She wore a tool belt slung across her hips, half mechanic, half defender of her people. Varon, despite his age, joined them, staff in hand. They're positioning at the outskirts, he reported grimly. We must hold them off long enough for them to realize the futility of aggression. Chris nodded, feeling the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders. He had never led a battle, let alone on an alien world. But he was the one who had introduced new technology and new hope. Now he had to help defend it. The first wave of attacks came from the city's north side, where a breach in the wall had been hastily reinforced. Sareth's men fired energy bolts, but the newly rigged shield projectors absorbed or deflected most of the blasts. Explosions of dust and sparks rattled the settlement. Civilians stationed at vantage points returned fire using salvaged rifles or launching improvised grenades. Now and then, a direct hit found its mark, sending attackers scattering. But still they advanced, determined to force a way in. Amid the chaos, Chris dashed between defensive emplacements, ensuring shield integrity. He replaced burnt-out capacitors, rerouted power flows, and watched in horror as some defenders were struck by energy bolts. He could not afford to falter. Every malfunction or short circuit spelled disaster for them all. Lena kept vigil at an overlook near the central gate, controlling a console that directed the settlement's biggest energy turret. She fired measured blasts, forcing the attackers into cover. Sareth himself could be seen stalking the battlefield. Towering over his own troops, he hurled challenges at the defenders, calling them cowards for hiding behind technology. His voice carried over the din. Lena, Offworlder, show yourselves if you dare. Chris felt a surge of anger. He climbed a ladder to Lena's position. We can't let him break through. If they breach the gate, we lose the power station. She nodded, determined. I'll hold them off. You go. Check the eastern perimeter. They might try a flank. He stole a quick kiss on her brow before darting off. As he ran through swirling dust, fear gnawed at his heart. War, once a distant concept in the dusty annals of Zyre's history, was real and terrifying. At the eastern side, he found a group of defenders pinned by suppressive fire. As he approached, a soldier collapsed, struck by an energy bolt. Chris dove behind a makeshift barricade and began adjusting a local power relay. With a surge of adrenaline, he reactivated the shield projector, generating a protective dome. The defenders regrouped, returning fire from relative safety. You did it, someone shouted, relief evident in their voice. Chris wiped sweat from his brow. Stay low, wait for a lull, then push them back. He sprinted to another vantage point where scattered black smoke signaled a fresh assault. The settlement was a patchwork of chaos, shouted orders, sizzling energy beams, improvised ballistic weapons crashing into walls. Amid it all, Chris's thoughts kept returning to Lena. Was she safe? Each time an explosion boomed, he felt his heart twist. Finally, an opportunity arose. With their forward momentum stalled, Saratha's troops resorted to heavier weaponry, portable artillery aimed at the central gate. An explosion rocked the gatehouse, sending a plume of dust skyward. The sound of crumpling metal churned Chris's stomach. If that gate fell, the settlement would be overrun. He spotted Lena clambering onto the gatehouse roof with a coil of cables slung across her shoulder. She raced to patch a failing conduit that powered the main turret. Chris beckoned for her to come down, but she either did not see him or refused to retreat. Lena, he shouted, panic lacing his voice. In that moment, a sizzling beam of energy from an enemy cannon seared through the air. She dove aside, barely evading it. The shots smashed into the turret's foundation, sending shards of metal and masonry in all directions. Chris's cry was lost in the cacophony. A wave of dust and debris enveloped the gatehouse. Chris coughed, eyes stinging as he scrambled toward the wreckage. His mind whirled with worst-case scenarios. Had Lena been hit? Buried under rubble? He reached the collapsed section of the wall, straining to hear any sign of her. Adrenaline surged. Shouting defenders darted past, some offering to help. Together, they shifted twisted beams and heavy blocks of stone, desperately searching. Then, with a gasp, he spotted her pinned under a fallen section of scaffolding. Her eyes fluttered open as they reached her. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, but she was alive. Chris and two others pried the debris away, freeing her. She grimaced in pain, and Chris gently lifted her into his arms. Relief mingled with anxiety. She could not fight in this condition. Through the swirling dust, he carried her to a sheltered alcove behind a half-intact building. A volunteer medic rushed in, quickly scanning her injuries. A broken arm, some cuts and bruises. We can stabilize her, but she's in no condition to keep fighting. Lena groaned, eyes half-lidded. I'm sorry, she murmured. I almost ruined everything. Chris pressed a gentle kiss to her hair. Hush, you've done more than enough. Emotion clenched his throat. He didn't realize how deeply he cared for her until he held her battered form in his arms. The prospect of losing her was too terrifying to contemplate. He blinked away tears, turning to the medic. Please, keep her safe. She was whisked into a hidden cellar where the wounded were being tended. The defenders regrouped outside, bracing for Saratha's next move. Chris forced himself to stand. The battle was not over. He clenched his fists, a resolute fury building within him. Checking his data collector, he saw that the shield coverage was down to 40%. The distribution nodes were overheating. They had to restore stability fast. With grim determination, Chris raced to the central power station. Inside, the hum of overtaxed machinery reverberated in his ears. Some areas had begun to spark and smoke. If the station blew, the entire settlement would be at Saratha's mercy. He navigated corridors of blinking control panels, finally reaching the main regulator. The readouts showed dangerously high levels. Unless they bypassed certain lines or reduced the load, meltdown was imminent. Can't let that happen, Chris breathed, reconfiguring the system. He rerouted auxiliary power to an emergency capacitor, then locked the station's core output to a safer level. The overhead lights dimmed as non-essential circuits lost power, but the shields and critical medical equipment retained function. A technician who'd been hiding in the station emerged, eyes wide. "We're losing external defenses if we drop output." Chris nodded grimly. "Better that than meltdown. Keep an eye on the shield status." They worked frantically, shutting down every non-critical subsystem. The city's meager lighting faded to darkness, replaced by the occasional flicker of battery-powered lanterns. Another wave of dust-laden tremors rocked the station, but the structural supports, once reinforced by Chris and Lena, held. It was an agonizing waiting game. Outside, the defenders fought valiantly, slowed but not broken by the partial shield coverage. Saratha's forces circled like predators. After what felt like hours, a hush seemed to descend over the battlefield. The roars of artillery ceased, replaced by an eerie quiet. Chris cautiously emerged from the station, scanning the horizon. The battered settlement smoldered in places, but stood intact. High above, the swirl of dust parted, revealing a swirl of twilight sky. To the west, Saratha's forces appeared to be retreating, their vehicles kicking up trails of retreating dust. A few scattered skirmishes persisted, but the main assault had faltered. Relief and disbelief washed over Chris. Had they driven Sarath off? Or was this a temporary lull? He wasted no time. Darting back to the cellar, he found Lena propped against a makeshift cot. Her arm was in a crude splint, and her head was bandaged. She opened her eyes at his approach. It's quiet," she whispered. Chris nodded, kneeling beside her. "They're pulling back. I think we won, or at least held them off." She let out a trembling sigh. "Thank the stars." He gently took her hand, tears of relief welling up. "I was so afraid I'd lose you." She managed a weak smile. "Not so easily." Exhausted but hopeful, they stayed like that, hand in hand, as the aftermath of the siege settled over the battered city. Over the following days, Sarath did not return. Scouts confirmed that his war band had withdrawn, likely realizing that capturing the caretaker's settlement was more difficult than expected. Chris and the others surmised they might regroup or seek an alliance with other enclaves. But for now, the battered defenders had a reprieve. The settlement had suffered casualties, though fewer than feared. Walls needed repair, and resources were scarcer than ever. Still, no one could deny they had achieved an unlikely victory, thanks to the combination of old Zyrian tenacity and off-world ingenuity. With her arm in a sling, Lena continued to supervise repairs. Chris focused on stabilizing the central power station, ensuring it could endure further tests. Together, they also worked on the old communicator device that an elder woman had presented weeks before. If they could reach beyond Zyre, perhaps they might request official help from the Interstellar Engineering Coalition. Little by little, the battered city found its footing again. People resumed routine chores, children emerged from hiding. A sense of cautious optimism took root. The near disaster brought the community closer, forging bonds that transcended old prejudices. Varon, though relieved at their survival, seemed more introspective. He called Chris and Lena to a meeting in the Grand Hall, where the caretaker's council gathered to discuss the future. "Sarath will not give up easily," one elder warned. "He may strike again, or stir trouble among other enclaves." Varon rubbed his temples. "True, we may be forced to negotiate, but let us first see if outside aid is possible." Another council member turned to Chris. "You have contact with starfaring societies, do you not?" Chris hesitated. "I came here alone. The coalition didn't expect me to find any survivors, so I don't have a direct link to a fleet or anything. But if we can repair this communicator or salvage the ship's array, I might be able to send out a distress signal. The coalition would at least open negotiations or send relief ships." Hope lit their faces, though some seemed wary of renewed off-world interference. The council eventually agreed to a plan. Chris and Lena would focus on restoring long-range communication. If successful, they would attempt to establish a stable link to the coalition, possibly forging a new era of cooperation. That evening, as dusk settled in, Chris and Lena found a quiet spot on a partially intact rooftop. The violet-hued sun cast long shadows across the spires, highlighting the damage, yet also revealing a certain stark beauty. They gazed across the city, arms entwined, the scars of recent battles etched into their memories. "I keep thinking about the promise we made to stand together," Chris said softly. Lena rested her head on his shoulder. Our union was supposed to be a statement against Seraph. But after the battle, I wonder if we can truly be together, free of that shadow. Chris pressed a tender kiss to her temple. We chose this path. Yes, partly for political reasons. But I don't regret it. My feelings for you have only grown stronger. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to make our bond real in every sense, not just as a symbolic gesture. She turned to him, eyes shining. Then I accept, wholeheartedly. Their foreheads touched, and in that intimate moment, they both felt a sense of destiny aligning. If Zyre could be rebuilt, if it could step out from the ashes of the past, then their union might become a beacon of unity between caretaker's daughter and off-world engineer. In a world still reeling from conflict and scarcity, there was little room for grand celebrations. Yet, the caretaker's council and the people insisted on a ceremony to commemorate the union of Lena and Chris. Hope, after all, was as vital to survival as the meager resources they hoarded. Word spread that on the day of the next rising moon, a pale orb tinted green by the atmosphere, the wedding would take place in the ancient courtyard before the grand hall. Preparations were simple but heartfelt. Children gathered wildflowers from hidden crevices, weaving them into garlands. A few artisans hammered precious metals into modest rings, the best they could craft from salvaged scraps. Chris helped wherever possible, feeling both excitement and a surreal sense of wonder. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined this scenario, forging a life bond with a near-human woman on a long-forgotten planet. Yet the more he thought about it, the more it felt right. On the day of the wedding, people assembled in the courtyard. The setting sun bathed crumbling columns in gold. Flickering lanterns illuminated the mosaic flooring, half buried under dust. Despite the battered environment, a joyous hush pervaded the gathering. Lena wore a simple dress fashioned from shimmering fabric she had salvaged, its silver threads reflecting her iridescent markings. A wreath of braided vines adorned her hair. Chris, in well-worn utility pants and a freshly cleaned shirt, felt somewhat underdressed, but the crowd's approving smiles eased his self-consciousness. Varan stood at the center, staff in hand. He delivered a solemn blessing in the old Zyrian language, calling upon the ancestors to witness this union, a promise of renewal and collaboration. Chris and Lena clasped hands. Their vows were brief but poignant, echoing in the still air. Chris, I pledge my skills, my loyalty, and my heart to you, Lena. From this day forth, I stand beside you, committed to safeguarding our people, our world, and our future together. Lena, I pledge my strength, my wisdom, and my love to you, Christopher Wynne. Together we will forge a new dawn for Zyre, guided by hope and unity. A gentle cheer arose as they exchanged rings. Lena's eyes brimmed with tears of joy. Chris felt his heart soar. At that moment, the swirling dust of the planet seemed to fade, replaced by a timeless warmth. They sealed the ceremony with a kiss. People came forward with congratulations, offering small tokens of appreciation, a newly forged tool, a piece of polished stone, a pouch of rare herbs. The settlement's modest resources were shared freely, a testament to the unity blossoming among them. As evening deepened, Chris held Lena close, gazing up at the stars that peeked through swirling dust clouds. She pressed her cheek against his. I never thought I'd see such a day. For so long, I believed Zyre was doomed to fade, that I'd be the last caretaker's daughter in a line stretching back centuries. Now, with you here, everything seems different. He kissed her softly. You're not alone anymore. We'll face whatever comes, together. In that tender moment, they were unaware that, miles away, Seraph brooded in a dark corner of the planet, anger and bitterness poisoning his thoughts. But for Chris and Lena, all that mattered was the quiet promise of tomorrow. Married life for Chris and Lena was anything but ordinary. They spent their honeymoon days hunched over terminals, elbow-deep in circuitry, laboring to repair the ancient communicator. Each success stoked excitement. Each setback tempered their hopes. Finally, after countless attempts and a plethora of creative workarounds, they managed to coax the device to power up. A faint hum emanated from its core, followed by a flicker of light across a small display. Chris held his breath, heart pounding. Lena watched from the side, her injured arm still in a sling. Is it actually working? Chris exhaled in amazement. It might. Let's see if it can broadcast on any known frequencies. He entered a series of commands, selecting standard coalition channels. The communicator crackled with static. Then, to their astonishment, a faint beep indicated a signal lock. Chris quickly sent a hail, typed in coalition codes, and waited in tense silence. Minutes passed. Then an audio signal sputtered through the speaker, distorted but recognizable as a human voice. Unknown station, please repeat. This is ICS Survey Vessel Aurora. Over. They stared at each other. Lena's eyes widened, tears forming at the corner of her eyes. Chris spoke into the microphone, voice shaking with emotion. This is Christopher Wynn, Interstellar Engineering Coalition contractor, located on planet Zyre. Requesting confirmation. Do you read us? Static hissed. Then the voice returned, clearer now. Affirmative, Christopher Wynn. We read you. State your condition. Over. Chris fought back laughter of sheer relief. We have survivors here, an entire settlement of Zyrians who require assistance. The planet is partially habitable, but heavily damaged. We need resources, medical aid, and negotiation. Please advise. A momentary silence. Then, stand by, Christopher Wynn. We'll relay to Coalition HQ. Expect further instructions. Over. The communication might be brief, but it was monumental. They had reconnected Zyre to the galactic community. Lena clutched Chris's uninjured arm, her face radiant with hope. News spread like wildfire through the settlement. People embraced in the streets, exclaiming, crying. The Caretaker's Council convened to discuss what this meant, how to prepare for potential off-world visitors, how to negotiate trade or humanitarian assistance. Chris and Lena exchanged a look of elation. This could change everything, Chris murmured. Though we must be cautious. Off-world interference can bring both help and exploitation. Lena nodded. We'll be ready. This time, we set the terms. Days turned into weeks, and the settlement vibrated with anticipation. The ICS survey vessel Aurora maintained contact, confirming that it had indeed forwarded a report to coalition officials. Preliminary negotiations began via radio. The coalition expressed astonishment at finding a living civilization on Zyre and pledged a diplomatic envoy once they could organize it. However, not everyone in the settlement rejoiced at the prospect. Some older inhabitants recalled past invasions and plunder by outsiders. A few radicals grumbled that letting foreigners in again would spell the end of Zyre's autonomy. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, despite the caretaker's pleas for unity. Sareth was conspicuously absent, but rumors trickled in that he was consolidating power among the more aggressive enclaves. The threat of conflict loomed, overshadowing the settlement's cautious optimism. Chris found himself juggling multiple roles: engineer, mediator, and caretaker's son-in-law. He worked tirelessly with Lena to expand the settlement's meager infrastructure in preparation for potential visitors. Together, they fortified the walls, improved the power grid, and even reclaimed a portion of farmland outside the city, hoping to demonstrate self-sufficiency. Despite the unrelenting workload, they shared moments of tender affection. Late at night, they would steal away to watch the stars, or share quiet meals in the workshop. Every gentle touch reminded them why they had chosen this path, why their unity mattered, not just to themselves, but to an entire people. One afternoon, as Chris inspected an upgraded solar array, a sentinel alerted him to a new arrival. A battered skimmer glided through the gates. From within emerged a messenger, breathing heavily and bearing an urgent missive from a distant enclave. Varon, Chris, and Lena gathered around as the messenger spoke. Sareth is forging alliances with enclaves that still practice old war customs. They seek to march against the caretaker's city, believing your off-world alliance is a betrayal of Zyrian tradition. A grim silence followed. Chris's mind raced. If Sareth amassed enough forces, even external help might arrive too late. He exchanged worried looks with Lena. Varon drew in a trembling breath. We must decide whether to stand and fight again, or to attempt negotiations. We have time, but not much. Lena straightened. We should try diplomacy first. Bloodshed will only bury us deeper. Chris nodded. We can at least propose a meeting under neutral terms. If Sareth rejects it, we'll fortify ourselves and hope the coalition envoy arrives in time. The Caretaker's Council agreed to dispatch a delegation under a flag of truce, carrying an offer to discuss a peaceful path forward. Yet in their hearts, many feared Saratha's thirst for power would overshadow reason. The next day, a small delegation set out. Chris volunteered, determined to stand by Lena, but she insisted on accompanying him, sling and all, unwilling to cede her responsibilities. Veron, being advanced in years, stayed behind to manage the settlement. They traveled across rugged terrain in an old transport that Chris had recently repaired. Dust storms and leftover radiation pockets made the journey perilous. After 2 days of cautious navigation, they arrived at a designated rendezvous, an ancient courtyard belonging to a once grand complex, now mostly rubble. Sarath and his allies were already there, a chilling sight. Warriors from multiple enclaves, all bearing archaic weapons, lined the perimeter. Their expressions were stern and suspicious. Sarath himself stood at the center, arms folded. His turquoise eyes burned with a triumphant glint. Lena and Chris stepped forward, accompanied by 3 unarmed elders from the caretaker's city. They raised their hands in greeting. Sarath did not return the gesture. "You have nerve, caretaker's daughter," he growled. "Coming into my domain." Lena inhaled, fighting to maintain composure. "We come seeking peace. You have seen that our city is defended. More bloodshed helps no one." Sarath sneered. "You speak of peace after defying the rightful union? After colluding with an off-worlder to tarnish our legacy?" Chris spoke up. "Sarath, the galaxy has changed. Zyre can't remain locked in the cycle of old wars. We've contacted the Coalition. Help is coming, but we want to unify Zyre under a new era, where enclaves can trade, share technology, and thrive." At the mention of off-world help, a ripple of anger spread among Saratha's allies. Some brandished weapons. Sarath raised his hand, quieting them, but his expression twisted with contempt. "You think we need off-worlders? That we are children to be coddled?" He spat on the ground. "No, I say we stand by our traditions, by our own might. Your caretaker's city was always proud, and now you kneel before foreign saviors." Lena bristled. "We do not kneel. We're forging alliances to uplift all of Zyre. No one should starve. No one should live in fear of raiders. We can help you upgrade your systems, improve harvests." Sarath laughed, cold and hollow. "Enough. You offer scraps, thinking to bribe us. But our ways are older and stronger than you know. We will not be reduced to beggars in your so-called new era. Surrender your city, caretaker's daughter. Dethrone your father, expel the off-worlder, and perhaps we will let your people live under our rule." Chris's anger flared. He instinctively stepped forward. "We will never accept that. We came to stop this madness, not capitulate to it. If you refuse to see reason, you'll doom this planet to another war." Sarath turned away, pacing. Then, without warning, he spun and pointed an electrified spear at Chris's chest. "A war that I intend to win. If you are so determined, then let us see how strong your resolve is. Zyre belongs to those with the will to claim it." A tense standoff ensued. Lena, her arms still in a sling, glared defiantly. The caretaker's elders tensed, hands trembling in the face of imminent violence. But then, a rumble in the distance drew everyone's attention. Dust swirled across the horizon. For a moment, Saratha's men readied their weapons, suspecting treachery. Then a glint of reflected sunlight emerged from the swirling haze, shapes descending from the sky. Chris blinked in astonishment. "Is that a coalition ship?" Multiple vessels, sleek and silvery, cut through the dusty atmosphere and hovered above the ruins. Their hulls bore the insignia of the Interstellar Engineering Coalition. The unexpected sight momentarily stunned Saratha's warriors. A calm, amplified voice echoed across the courtyard. "This is Commander June of the Interstellar Engineering Coalition. We come in peace, responding to a request for aid. We request all armed parties stand down." Saratha's face contorted with fury. "They dare." The lead coalition vessel lowered a small craft, from which uniformed figures emerged. They wore advanced breathing apparatus and carried non-lethal sidearms. The tension in the courtyard reached a boiling point, each faction poised for combat, uncertain whether to trust this new intrusion. Chris felt hope surge despite the danger. "Maybe we can finally have reason prevail," he murmured to Lena, who nodded, though her face was tight with apprehension. A female officer, presumably Commander June, strode forward, flanked by soldiers in protective gear. Her eyes swept over Saratha's forces, then landed on Chris. Recognition dawned on her features. Christopher Wynne. Chris stepped out, raising a hand. Yes, I'm Chris. This is Lena, caretaker's daughter. These are delegates from our city. Please, Sarath is about to. But Sarath roared, invaders. We will not bow to you. A flick of his spear signaled his men, who aimed archaic cannons at the coalition craft. Commander June lifted her palm. We do not seek conquest. We received a distress call and are authorized to offer humanitarian assistance, with no violation of local sovereignty. She looked pointedly at Sarath. But we also have a mandate to protect civilian life if threatened. Sarath hesitated, reading the advanced weaponry on display. He might sense that direct conflict with the coalition would be suicidal. Still, pride and hatred clouded his judgment. He snarled, addressing his allies. Stand down for now. Let us see what these foreigners do. Commander June nodded. Thank you. She turned back to Chris and Lena. We understand you have a functioning settlement with partial infrastructure, seeking a broader alliance? Lena exhaled. Yes, Commander. We want to rebuild Zyre, not tear it apart. But Sarath threatens to plunge us into war. Commander June regarded Sarath. We will abide by local governance. However, the coalition has the means to broker peace if both sides are willing to negotiate. If not, we will protect those who choose peace. Sarath's lip curled, but he remained silent, perhaps realizing he was outmaneuvered. Chris glanced at Lena. A flicker of optimism illuminated her features. They might have a chance to unify Zyre under peaceful terms, with the coalition as mediator. But it would require delicate maneuvering and the goodwill of both sides. In the following days, a precarious negotiation unfolded under the watchful eye of coalition mediators. Sarath, forced by circumstances, agreed to meet with caretakers' representatives in a newly established neutral zone. Coalition observers provided security, ensuring no one initiated hostilities. Chris and Lena attended each session, explaining Zyre's technological needs, the potential for off-world trade, and the benefits of cooperation. Sarath's allies listened with skepticism, but some saw the advanced coalition vessels and recognized that resisting their technology would be a path of futility. Others clung to pride, believing they could preserve their autonomy without outside help. Commander June skillfully navigated local customs, offering limited yet enticing glimpses of how the coalition could aid in environmental cleanup, infrastructure rebuilding, and possible recolonization efforts by volunteers from the galaxy. She stressed that the caretaker city would remain the official seat of local governance, with the caretaker's council representing Zyrian interests. Sarath's final stance boiled down to a single demand. My ancestors commanded these lands long before your caretaker was chosen. I will not be a subject under any new system. Varan, old and weary, spoke calmly. Then be a leader in it. Stand with us, share in the new era. No one is asking you to be a subject. We ask you to set aside hostility and harness your people's strength for rebuilding. The tension was palpable as Sarath mulled it over, turquoise eyes flicking between the caretaker's delegation and the coalition forces. Finally, he inclined his head slightly, the closest thing to an admission of defeat. I will not kneel, he repeated. But if your new order respects my heritage, and if there is mutual benefit, I will consider a truce. A collective exhale of relief rustled through the tent. Chris squeezed Lena's hand, heart pounding. They had found a fragile path forward, free from immediate bloodshed. Over the next week, the Caretaker's Council and Sarath's faction hammered out a Zyrian accord, overseen by Commander June. It guaranteed free passage between enclaves, cooperative resource management, and external assistance from the coalition for infrastructure revival. While the arrangement lacked total harmony, it was a significant breakthrough for a planet mired in centuries of conflict. At the signing ceremony, Sarath's signature was last. He scrawled his name on the battered parchment, then fixed Lena with a sharp glare. She met his gaze steadily, her sling still on, a testament to the cost of their battles. Finally, Sarath stepped away. Commander June, satisfied, announced, "This is the first step in reclaiming Zyre. The coalition commends all parties for their willingness to find a peaceful path." Applause and subdued cheers followed, though many eyes lingered on Sarath, uncertain if he would keep his word in the long run. Still, it was more than any had hoped for just a few weeks prior. Lena turned to Chris, resting her head on his shoulder. "We did it," she whispered, a note of wonder in her voice. He placed a gentle kiss on her temple. "Yes, and though it's just the start, I believe in Zyre's future." In the months that followed, the caretaker city became the de facto hub for planetary restoration efforts. Coalition engineers established a small outpost, collaborating closely with Chris, Lena, and local specialists. They introduced water purification systems, helped contain residual radiation, and assisted in constructing more efficient solar farms. Sareth maintained his enclave's independence, but allowed coalition teams to assess water tables and salvage old technology from ruined sectors. His warriors remained watchful, yet violence did not erupt. Some enclaves joined wholeheartedly in the restoration, sending supplies and labor to the caretaker city in exchange for advanced medical care and knowledge. Under Commander June's guidance, a permanent communications link was established, enabling calls to coalition ships and even the possibility of tourism or trade. A handful of adventurous traders arrived, exchanging supplies for relics of Zyrian craftsmanship. The caretaker's settlement slowly stirred to new life, reawakening after centuries of isolation. For Chris and Lena, each day was filled with purpose, and each night a time of quiet intimacy. They shared a modest home, half built from old architecture and half from newly fabricated materials. Arm in arm, they would stroll the city's reinforced walls, greet neighbors, and discuss the next engineering challenge. Varan, growing frail, found solace in seeing the caretaker's lineage continue. He entrusted many duties to Lena and Chris, confident they would lead Zyre into a peaceful era. Yet, the planet still bore many scars. Vast swathes of desert, lethal radiation zones, hidden pockets of hostility. But hope thrived, nurtured by the cooperation of once-warring enclaves and guided by the handshake between local traditions and off-world science. One quiet evening, Chris and Lena stood on a lofty balcony atop the caretaker's tower, gazing at the horizon. The wind rustled Lena's hair, now free of its sling. She had mostly healed, though a faint scar on her shoulder remained. Below them, the settlement streets glowed with newly installed lighting. The hum of electricity had become a symbol of progress, a far cry from the dim, fearful nights Chris first encountered. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. She leaned into him, eyes shining as she surveyed the city. "About how far we've come. It feels like a lifetime ago that I was alone, struggling to keep this place alive." Chris pressed a kiss to her cheek. "You've accomplished something extraordinary, Lena. Your people can finally glimpse a future beyond survival." She turned, smiling. "We did it together. You saved us from meltdown, literally and metaphorically." A comfortable silence followed, punctuated by the soft whistle of wind through the tower's broken spires. Far above, stars glittered. A hint of cosmic dust gave the sky an otherworldly sheen. Then Lena raised a tentative question that had weighed on her mind. "Chris, do you ever regret staying here on Zyre? You had a life elsewhere, a career. The Coalition might pull you back at any time." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, meeting her gaze earnestly. "My life is here now. My home is with you. If the Coalition demands my return, I'll negotiate on my own terms. There's nothing in the galaxy as important to me as you, and the future we're building." Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of joy. She cradled his face in her hands. "I love you, Chris Wynn." He smiled, voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, Lena of Zyre." They kissed under the starlight, the hush of the reborn city below bearing witness. Despite lingering tensions and the daunting task of planetary restoration, hope had taken root in Zyre's soil at last. Through cooperation, the planet's enclaves and the Coalition set about healing the scars of war. Under Lena and Chris's leadership, the caretaker city stood as a beacon of possibility, a symbol of what could be achieved when ancient heritage and modern expertise joined forces. And though Sareth remained an ever-watchful presence, he abided by the newly forged accords, perhaps biding his time, or perhaps accepting that Zyre's new course did not diminish his own stature. Only time would tell if peace would endure. For Chris and Lena, their union, once a desperate gambit, became the cornerstone of a grand narrative. Two souls from different worlds, bound by love and common purpose, striving to uplift an entire civilization from the ashes. Each day, they faced new challenges. Each night, they dreamed of an ever-brighter dawn. On an evening resonant with gentle wind and shimmering starlight, the caretaker's tower echoed with quiet laughter and the hum of machines. In a small laboratory off the main hall, Chris and Lena stood side by side, calibrating a new type of solar collector. Far below, children ran in the streets without fear, and families prepared evening meals in well-lit homes. A modest peace had been won. A new chapter in Zyrian history had begun, and in that promise, an entwined future of hope, discovery, and enduring love. Zyre itself breathed once more, no longer a planet condemned to oblivion, but one reborn under the guardianship of its resilient inhabitants and an off-world engineer who had found, at last, his true home. In the stillness of a reborn night, where violet suns and green moons illuminate broken towers that gleam with renewed life, a gentle hush settles over Zyre. From afar, one might see the shimmering grid of solar arrays, a testament to unity across differences, beckoning travelers and inhabitants alike to believe in second chances. For Chris and Lena, their story does not end here. It continues in the laughter of children, the progress of healing fields, the fellowship around repaired machines, and the quiet vow in each other's arms. A vow that transcends old tragedies, forging a future suffused with the bright, undying light of hope. And so, our tale ends in happiness, with a once desperate planet now stirring toward renewal, and a union born of adversity blossoming into genuine devotion, an enduring alliance between human and alien, hand in hand, heart with heart, charting a new destiny among the stars.